Hello, friends, and welcome to today's webcast. I am Chris from eCornell, and I'm joined by Colin Campbell and Tom Campbell from the Center for Nutrition Studies. We're going to be discussing today, excuse me, as you know, because you signed up for it, nutrition and popular media. And we're going to be taking a look at a book called The Plant Paradox that has just been released recently. There was an article that was recently published, kind of a response, a commentary that was published by both of you on the Center for Nutrition Studies website. There is a link to that article for those of you who are kind of coming in cold to the conversation. You'll see in the lower left there, excuse me, that there's a link to the article itself, which you can hover over and open if you want to take a look at the article as the discussion is going on. In addition, because eCornell and the Center for Nutrition Studies are co-producers of a certificate program in plant-based nutrition, we've also included the link for the certificate program in the lower, just below the chat window. We'll take your questions throughout. We have a lot of people who have signed up and attended today, several hundred, so I'm sure the questions will be pretty spirited and they'll probably be flying in pretty fast. But we have a lot to talk about, so let's kick it off. So we had discussed this book a little bit beforehand. This is not a debunking session per se, but we are going to explore why a book like this might have taken hold. Where did the popularity come from? Why are we even discussing this book at all? Do you want to kick that off, Tom?
Well, I think that there are numerous things that come up frequently that sort of contradict in the popular media, that contradict a plant-based diet message. You know, whether it's the most recent study headline or the most recent popular book that's suggesting a whole gamut of messages, right? And most of the time we don't have time to respond. The Plant Paradox is something that we got a number of questions about because I think it's been a top 100 bestseller ever since it came out, you know, most of the year. So it's kind of this, it's a very catchy story, a very catchy book with someone who touts tremendous credentials. And so we just were getting so many questions that I think we felt like we had to address this specifically, but absolutely. I mean, I think we should talk about like why a book like this takes hold and the bigger questions. And I know you probably want to say something, Dad, to kind of introduce, but I just want to make a mention. When we wrote the China study, a few years after the China study came out, I remember talking to a physician, actually Dr. Bob Klein in Rochester, and he said to us, he said that he had gotten the China study and he had gone through, he was reading all these amazing things, and he had seen the references, the citations, and he actually went to the library, the medical library, pulled out all the citations, and he said to us, and the citations actually said what you said they said. And in the back of my head, that was the first time I'd gotten that comment. In the back of my head, I said, well, I was thinking like, well, that's a random comment. Like, of course, you know, why would we do citations that didn't support, you know, but reading this book and looking at it more in depth, now I know why he was impressed, because I have to say that, you know, the method of laying out a scientific argument in this book is concerning, to say the least. You know, looking through the specific citations. I mean, I was very interested to read this book, and I thought, I don't know, I'm no expert in lectins. I don't know that much about the biochemistry of the lectins and so forth. So I wanted to learn a lot. I started going through, in the way I started seeing these amazing claims, looking the citations up and looking the studies up, and finding that many of the studies don't support at all what the sentence just said. They suggest the opposite of what his message is, or it's not even related, or sometimes it's not even remotely related to what the sentence just said. It was just like someone randomly picking a keyword of the sentence and finding a journal article that had that keyword in it, and then putting that as a citation. I mean, there were examples, I should say, not everyone, but examples where the scientific sort of justification, the scientific process of making health claims in this book just was apparently, you know, totally broken. I don't know how that was. But,
let me ask you this: Is it? Are you alone in your kind of observation of the of the criticism of the citations? I mean,
Well, I
the
mean,
academic rigor and research that kind of went into it.
I don't.
What's the word on the street?
Well, among the plant-based community, I think
Yeah.
we're all in agreement.
Okay.
You can speak to that as well, of course. How do you feel about it when because we did this sort of together. We sort of picked it up and read it together.
What were your impressions, Colin, when you read the book?
I'm the same as Tom,
Uh-huh.
essentially. We wrote the article, co-authored the article together.
Yeah.
But this raises a larger question having to do with the extent to which claims like this are justified by the evidence. Namely, the evidence we call science, the evidence that's published in good, reliable journals and that sort of thing. And I agree with Tom. I mean, when you start looking at specific claims here, checking against the references, it doesn't square. And so it's just it's a story that's made, quite frankly, out of some thin air. And this, unfortunately, has been happening, for some years now. And I find it really disturbing because the message that we happen to be talking about here and what was referenced in the China study and some other books of our ilk, essentially, we believe this message really is based on evidence. And so now all of a sudden, everybody's coming out with these other claims, rather specious kinds of claims. And this is how it happens in a sense. I see nutrition particularly, because that's what we're talking about here, the science of nutrition. I see nutrition being a science by which you've got a whole, almost an infinite number of things working together to create the response. And with all these sort of details that make up the whole, here's what happens. People can come along who might want to disagree with what we do and pick out one of these things and claim that's the whole story. And that's really what I think in this case here, it illustrates that point. And this is not the only one that did that. To talk about lectins as a class, rather strange class of chemicals, I should say. We don't talk about that too much in science. The best known one is gluten. That's received a lot of attention in recent years.
Right.
But far too much attention, I should add.
Yeah.
But in any case, this is a group of substances that sound rather technical and fancy, maybe important. And he picks out one in this particular case, in one instance at least, that's even worse than gluten, in a sense. And it just, from the scientific point of view, from the biological point of view, that doesn't happen. Things are working together. And so many of the books that are coming out just pick out their favorite thing, dress it up with so-called reference lists that usually doesn't count, or not include any reference at all. That was the way it traditionally was done. And so we get a lot of miscommunication and confusion, and it's a lot of noise in the system, through which we can find it very difficult to actually discern what the real evidence might be. And it is a really troubling process. I've been in science for 6 decades,
Right.
and actually doing experimental research. And in our trade, we have some rules and some courtesies too, but we have some really profound rules that we like to follow in order to validate claims. We publish it. We publish it in journals where we're held accountable professionally for what we say. And so, references are important, especially if you list them when you talk about things, so other people can come back and have a look. Like Tom just said, have a look at the references and see what they say. The average reader doesn't do that. So they kind of just sort of jump in there. If they like the message, they go with it.
Right.
And so all of a sudden we got an enormous amount of confusion.
So we're talking about the methodology and approach here, right? We've discussed that. We actually failed to talk about it broadly about the message. If we were to condense the message of the book, what is Gundry getting at here?
Well, his story is that plants don't want to be eaten, so they've built up defenses against being eaten, and those defenses are unhealthy for humans, the eaters.
Okay.
And those defenses are coming in the form of lectins, and lectins are a class of chemicals that cause just about every, or exacerbate, as he says, most chronic diseases that we face.
What about weight gain?
Oh, everything.
Okay. All right.
From cancer, heart disease, weight, fatigue, sluggishness, Parkinson's.
Okay.
Patients have supposedly gotten better avoiding lectins from an enormous, astonishing array of conditions. And the lectins are particularly prominent in things like whole grains and beans. And this is where the story begins to clash with other sort of well-established nutrition guidelines, because the experience of most of the people in the world has been that the more beans they eat, for example, in a culture, the healthier they are. The more whole grains compared to other foods, it's linked to lower rates of cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease and so forth. So, now we are starting to get into if lectins are the evil thing and beans and whole grains have all these lectins, but boy, we've really got some astonishing claims coming fast and furious. The nightshade vegetables, kind of a hot topic. Tomatoes and peppers and all the rest of the nightshade vegetables have lectins, so they should not be eaten. And now you're getting into avoiding a lot of vegetables, botanically fruits. Botanically they're fruits, but a lot of different fruits and vegetables, beans, whole grains for preventing chronic disease. And so that kind of boils down to the overall message. It's very catchy. I mean, I can imagine a plant doesn't want to be eaten.
Yes. Right.
And it sounds good. And it makes sense. Like, oh yeah, some plants are poisonous, and in fact, some lectins. There are examples of lectins being bad. And so you kind of tie these pieces together, and it makes a catchy story.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's evidence too that some lectins are beneficial.
Right.
How's that? Honest about it. And that's, again, taking things out of detail. A lot of things, there's substances in food, if you will, plants too, at certain doses, they are doing what they're supposed to do, very good things, quite frankly. But if they're consumed way in excess or consumed in isolation of the rest of the plant or such, we can expect to see some difficulties oftentimes. There's also some toxic materials sometimes that are present in nature, in plants, for example. They're toxic when you test them and at higher doses and so forth. But in reality, when you really look at them in the whole food form, they almost are like having homeopathic kinds of effects. It can actually be beneficial. Right. We did some research years ago. Yeah. And we took the most potent of all carcinogens, really potent, and actually were able to show that a little bit of that prior to initiating cancer, for example, actually prevented cancer. Yeah. And lowered cancer risk. Okay. So a lot has to do with the dose that matters. It's the dose. And that's why I kind of like the idea of going back to nature and just looking at the whole plant and seeing how much is there. And that's usually the amount of these individual things that we should be consuming in the form of food.
So if we were to, again, sort of step back, what is the prescription that Gundry is offering here?
So I have a, actually I put some slides together about his food guide. And, when you talk about a diet book, the rubber really hits the road with the food guide. And we'll just pull up those slides and take a look at what's allowed on the diet and what's to be avoided. Because I've noticed a trend in some of the popular books recently that, it's very hard to say anymore that plant-based diets are bad if you are honestly evaluating the research. And so some authors try to straddle the line. They say, in this book is a good example, you can be vegetarian and follow the diet. You can be, they sort of throw out niceties about plant-based diets. The rubber hits the road at the food guide, at what you can eat or not eat.
Okay. And this is an example of
this is an example. So this is a picture actually from the pages of the book. These are foods that are acceptable. You see a number of oils, a number of sweeteners. There's some nuts and seeds. There's some plants. There's olives. Very hot, of course, mostly fat and nuts and seeds. Olives are high fat. Dark chocolate, if it's 72% or greater, that sounds fantastic. Vinegars, obviously some herbs and seasonings. Then some very odd categories of energy bars, which are, these must be, these processed things. Flours, which again, it's nice that you can have flours, but these are not typical flours. It's, who has green banana flour in their pantry at home? What about tiger nut flour? Do you have some?
I have nasturtium at home, and that's about where it stops.
Okay. There's coconut milk ice cream, and then going forward, foodles. Any name for acceptable noodles. His name for acceptable noodles. Those are things not made from grains. Kelp noodles, sweet potato noodles, Korean sweet potato noodles. You have those in your pantry, right? Too, of course. Lots of dairy products, actually. Lots of cheese. including heavy cream and sour cream, whey protein powder, and wine, red wine, spirits, fish, fruits. You'll notice, interestingly, you want to limit all of these but avocado. So these are here sort of at your own risk. Vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, other vegetables. You'll see here that, when I talk to patients, I talk about calorie density. And if you look at this list of vegetables, these are all very low calorie density vegetables. These are leafy vegetables. In a pound of spinach, there's about 100 calories in a pound of spinach. So you have to, that's like a family pack size, clamshell kind of thing in my grocery store of spinach. That's a lot of spinach. So you can imagine you can't even get remotely close to a day's worth of calories from spinach unless you're eating like several wheelbarrows full. And that's basically the foods that's allowed. There's some starches, but super specific, weird sort of products. And then some things like green plantains. I mean, here you are getting some things that people eat: cassava, sweet potatoes, or yams. And then poultry, but it's not just any poultry. It has to be pastured poultry, not free range, grass-fed, grass-finished meat, and some processed plant-based meats. Okay, so
by design, it's prohibitive in some way.
Those are things that you can eat, and even though there's a fairly long list, these are weird products. A lot of them are very odd products that are hard to find. Odd products. So what the heck are you eating? You're eating oil. You're eating meat, if you can, grass-fed meat, and gosh, some vegetables that have no calories, that have no energy. So what are you avoiding? The lectin-containing foods. You're avoiding all refined starchy foods: pasta, rice, potatoes, tortillas, bread. So basically all the grains you're avoiding. Sugar, of course. Vegetables. Let's talk about you're avoiding peas. Anything starchy, that's a vegetable. Peas, all beans. You can have some of these things in pressure cooker if you pressure cook them. Lentils. So vegans and vegetarians can have beans in phase 2, but only if they are properly prepared in a pressure cooker. No grains. Fruits, including the botanically speaking fruits that we know as vegetables, things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplant. Non-Southern European cow's milk products, sprouted grains, grasses, and then some oils. So when I look at this list, I could not imagine sitting down with a patient, giving them a list of things that they could eat like this, and imagine them walking away with a sensible dietary plan going forward from it. It's so restrictive. The things you can eat, many of them are terrifically odd products that are hard to find. And you're avoiding all the plant foods that have calories. So in terms of calorie densities, the things in plants that have calories are the starchy foods. They're beans, they're whole grains, they're root vegetables like potatoes. There's some sweet potato or yam here. But otherwise, you're avoiding all the calories. So what this ends up being, if you were to actually do this, if you avoid all the starchy plants, and this is a common formula for these books, throw out some niceties in the language about plant-based diets or vegetarianism, but then when you get to the food guide, you're avoiding all the starchy carbohydrates. And what it amounts to be is a fairly low carbohydrate, high fat diet.
High protein.
Basically low carb.
Can I interject here just for a second? When I saw that table as I was getting into the book, I did what I often do in books like this. I just turned the page. because quite frankly, when people, I know this is very popular, is desirable, and people want to hear this, that kind of detail, specific foods listed here in this category, eat a lot of this, not so much here, avoid these, all that kind of definition, for food identities or food amounts, that makes it look fancy. That makes it look like, this is quite scientific. I'm just feel certain all these foods that are listed here were not adequately tested, for whether they're good, bad, or different. They're just kind of listed, but they look good.
Right.
And quite frankly, that's a sort of a technique in my view, to make this message, the whole message, in a sense, sound scientific.
Yeah, it puts a
And
nice,
I find it really, really challenging. I just don't accept that.
it puts a very specific prescription to it. And you know, the thing is too that if you cut out all your carbohydrates and you're eating a standard American diet, absolutely loaded with, you know, refined grains, tons of sugar, are you going to get healthier and feel better? In the short term, you are. In the short term, you are. You're going to lose weight. You know, people with blood sugar issues can see improvements, dramatic improvements in blood sugar. You know, there's some virtue in simply restricting your calorie intake dramatically. And actually, you could make this claim about people just starting veganism, to be honest, but at the beginning of veganism. But if you just cut out huge amounts of foods and eat fewer calories, you're going to do better. So that's that kind of nugget of truth, I think, that a lot of these books have and make them particularly confusing.
Yeah, the biggest lies, in all respects, the biggest lies oftentimes have a kernel of truth in them. And that's really, I mean, that's the way it works. A lot of these sort of fancy claims and stuff like that, you can always find a kernel of truth. You know, by that I mean, if you take that little truth out and test it in the laboratory, you know, all by itself, you might see some results that look promising. But that's not the way things work.
Right.
You have to go back to the food and look at there. So
Right. Put it through its rigorous paces.
Put it through.
Yeah, exactly. Let me chime in really quick. There's a lot of spirited discussion going on in the chats here. I do want to ask you, if you have specific questions, please chime in. A lot of heavy opinions and convictions, as you can imagine. So how does this book kind of fit into the trend, if I were to distill several questions down at once, which is, how does this fit into more recent trends? There's some reference to the Paleo diet. Is this indicative of trends that are going out in the nutrition world?
Well,
More broadly.
Not in the professional nutrition world,
Okay.
for the most part.
Okay.
It is with the public. Because, as my friend Dr. John McDougall has said before, people like to hear good things about their bad habits.
Yep.
So these books come out, you know, sort of confirming or affirming the kind of diets that most people use. That's why the books sell. You know, they don't have to change too much, a little bit dressing up here and there. And that's really what it comes down to. So these kind of books in recent times have often been those that essentially are taking on the plant-based diet idea. We can name some of them, starting with the Atkins book in the beginning and some version of that, Paleo diet. I mean, as Tom just described, if you look more carefully, you know, at the nutrient content of these kind of diets, they're high in protein, high in fat, which basically means more and more animal-based foods. That's what it's saying. And that's they have that in the aggregate. That's what they are intended to follow.
That's actually true of, there's a popular book about eating fat to lose weight. Recently, there's popular books about gluten, you know, gluten, avoiding gluten, and then this book. And if you look at the actual food guides and the, you know, where the rubber hits the road, they all want people to avoid the starchy vegetables or severely limit starchy vegetables. And as soon as you take those away, you can't get many calories from plants. And you're talking about a diet, if you want to sustain yourself on that diet, you're talking about a diet that's very high in fat, protein, and animal foods, particularly from animal foods.
That's the hidden agenda.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. So this has been a trend that keeps popping up over and over and over and over.
You know, I wanted to ask about the hidden agenda component. You said that relates to a recommendation of some kind of meat-based protein, right? Can we discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, the word protein, by the way, from its origin in the middle 1800s, was generally assumed to be only from animal foods. So in fact, protein, meat, they were almost like synonymous.
People still do that.
And they still do that because that's the way it works. But in reality, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was discovered that plants had protein too. But then the narrative that evolved from there was, plant proteins aren't as good, aren't as high quality as the animal proteins. That lasted for quite a long time, which incidentally is not quite true. That's not the right terminology. So we can get all the protein we need from plants, all of it. We don't need to turn to, you know, the meat-based, dairy-based foods, for example, to get the protein. That's a really big issue if we look at the history of this field. It's this reverence we've had for making sure we get enough protein. That in turn is reflecting almost a reverence for eating meat and dairy.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Right.
And people don't want to give that up.
Yeah.
And that's another whole story in and of itself. Where did that come from? Where did we get this notion that we had to have protein, quote unquote, animal-based foods? That's been a hard one hard not to crack, in this discussion. But
you've been on a tireless quest to crack that nut for a while, I bet. Let me on the cover of the book, as you can see, there's a squash tomato.
Yeah.
You talked about nightshades, nightshades, and things along those lines. What's the deal there?
Well,
what's the controversy?
There's some component of nightshade vegetables that is theoretically found to be inflammatory. But if you look at the overall content, overall effect of a tomato per se, I mean, there's evidence that tomato is actually highly anti-inflammatory. Right. So again, it's kind of an example of people pulling one component, one chemical out of the bunch that is found in one study to cause some harm or inflammation. Suddenly, you have statements about the entire class of plants. The effects of eating the whole foods from the entire class. So, the bottom line is, from a practical point of view, I absolutely do not recommend that people avoid nightshade vegetables out of, the general population avoid nightshade vegetables. If anything, they seem to be quite healthy.
What were your favorite parts about the book? There must have been something did you like anything about it? I said we weren't going to be on a debunking mission here.
Well, one of the favorite parts of it, in terms of revelation.
Okay.
Was actually toward the end. The emphasis given to the use of supplements, which this author happens to sell.
Good, a couple chat points on that.
And that's another issue. Nutrient supplements are not the same as those nutrients found in food.
Okay, so to back up, why is that?
Well, nutrient supplements, when taken in isolation,
yep,
oftentimes will do the reverse as what they do when in food.
I mean, meaning the body's ability to retain them or to process them and use them?
There's a classic study done in the 1990s, a joint study between the United States and Finnish scientists on beta carotene. At that time, there was no beta carotene, pro-vitamin A, as you say, really good stuff, antioxidants and colors and all that. That was associated when people consume vegetables with lots of beta carotene, they got less lung cancer from smoking. So they did a study. Okay, let's take the beta carotene out. Let's do a big study. Take the beta carotene out, put it in a pill. Then we can give it to smokers to see what happens. You know what happened? The beta carotene in the form of the pill actually increased lung cancer rates and total mortality. It was significant. But the beta carotene, on the other hand, coming from the food, that was associated with a decreased risk, as there should be. And then there were a number of studies in the years since that have shown that these nutrient supplement studies that have been done, allegedly, maybe for good purposes, for good, for real interest at the time, are actually showing that they do not do, in fact, what those nutrients do when they're consumed in food. That's a big issue.
I have concerns about how supplements kind of fit into alternative medicine and practices in general. I've had patients come to me knowing that I'm into nutrition and plant-based diets and assuming that I'm a very alternative physician. And they have seen other alternative physicians, and they come in with like a 5-page, 6-page form of test results of things that I've hardly ever seen tested before in any of my medical practice. All these nutritional related chemicals and so forth, dozens and dozens of things. And they've gone to an alternative practitioner, and they've had all this blood drawn and all this testing. And invariably, every single time I've seen this happen, people come with a large slew of these results are out of the healthy range that's in these reports. And so, I can remember one example, one interaction I had with one patient, and I said, I just was she was very upset, very anxious. All these things were outside the normal range. And I just tried to reassure her, these things are not so certain, all these numbers, I don't even know what numbers would be appropriate for this chemical. I don't know where they're getting these numbers, but you're getting this a very official lab report. It says you're abnormal, you better fix it. And I took that report, and after the visit, I went and I started looking at the actual numbers for each chemical and started looking at and they were totally different from standard reference lab values. These were not standard reference lab values. These were numbers that some company had just made up to what they think is the optimal number someone should have. And their science behind coming up with numbers like that is very complex. I can tell you this was not scientifically justified. And if you have, suddenly that a dozen things now looking red in red bars with an asterisk and said, abnormal, high, low, what do you do then? Well, you go review it with the practitioner. And what's the next step? You get prescribed supplements. And in many cases, dozens of different supplements. And that's a model that really, every time I see it or hear it, I try to have an open mind, but my red flags go straight up, because I get very concerned about a model of over-testing and then the resulting over-prescription of supplements. That's a common business model. Mm-hmm. And one of the most revelatory statements, I think, actually was in Dr. Gundry's acknowledgments in this paper. He acknowledged his lab staff. I can't remember his exact language, but he thanks them. He admits that his patients give up to a dozen vials of blood for testing every couple months at his clinic. A dozen vials. I can't imagine as a physician what the heck I do with a dozen vials of blood.
And analyzing all the things.
And analyzing, I'm sure, very weird, non-standard nutritional related things that we don't know good reference ranges for, and coming up with results that emphasize a prescription of vast numbers of supplements. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if that doesn't kind of raise your warning signs right there, that kind of did it for me.
Yeah, me too. As I said, that was one of the more informative parts.
One of the revelatory moments.
It really was.
So I'm looking at a lot of questions fly by. I think it's best to try to distill them. Why the fascination with proteins? This chat is just packed with it. What are we talking about here as it relates to this book?
Well, as I said before, protein was discovered in 1839, to be specific, by a Dutch chemist.
Okay.
It was found in meat. It was a chemical found in meat that was required for survival. Uh-huh. Without protein, we wouldn't survive. And that's absolutely true. Protein is an essential nutrient. Yep. It's not whether it's essential or not essential, it's how much we're consuming and what kind.
Okay.
In any case, when it was first discovered in the form of meat, it became synonymous with meat, as I said before. Yep. It was a surrogate. It's sort of a surrogate nutrient to justify the consumption of animal-based foods. And as I said, it's another question of how we got onto that idea, which is probably generations old, maybe centuries old. Uh-huh. We had to have that kind of thing. In the very beginning, it was called the stuff of civilization itself.
Okay.
That's the way some of the original scientists looked at it.
Right.
And they said the word protein itself comes from the Greek word proteos, means of prime importance. So it was baptized straight off.
I got it.
As, this is it.
Right. Start with this and everything else.
Yeah, and then civilization would follow. Mm-hmm. The more protein you had.
Right.
And all these wild claims that were occurring for 100 years.
Sure.
Ever since. And so it's with that kind of background that we've had to live with in our psyche and our backgrounds, it's hard to break away from it. But now we know, of course, and that's research that I've been involved in myself, when you start putting in that kind of protein, animal protein, above the levels that we actually need, that distorts the rest of the diet. Yep. Because we consume the protein usually in the form of foods. You put in more of those foods, you're decreasing the consumption of the foods that we should be consuming. And the protein-based foods, the high-protein, animal-based foods, they're sort of pro-oxidizing. And that's it, pro-inflammatory.
Got it.
And that in itself, and a whole bunch of other sort of effects, that tends to elevate the risk for disease.
Go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, I think we run, and also just to add on to that, we can debate till the cows come home about the effects of protein. And
not till the cows come home.
I think in general, animal protein has a lot of knocks against it. But I also just want to emphasize how important it is to think about whole foods as opposed to the macronutrients of protein. I can't tell you how many times I hear you pick one of these three options, whether it's, you go to a takeout restaurant bar or something, pick some vegetables, and then the next step is pick your protein.
Mhm.
They'll say the sign like that, and people use that language all the time, and pick your protein.
That's right.
And, 7/8 of it is meat.
Yep.
Right. And then you
Right.
have tofu.
Yep.
Or something like that. And so that's a really distorted understanding of the nutrient and whole foods in general that I think has not served us very well. So I think it's very important also just to remember, bring it back to foods, and then even beyond food, thinking foods, dietary patterns that are very important for overall health and disease.
So when we discuss a plant-based diet as advocated or prescribed by you guys, are we talking about any animal products at all? Veganism, vegetarianism is a recurring theme here. How do any animal products kind of figure into the overall scheme?
I like the concept goal. Yesterday I was just talking with Tom on this point. I like the concept from the scientific point of view. Here's a goal where we should go, in my view. And that's as close to a whole food, plant-based diet, 100% all the way.
Got it.
Now, and then take steps along toward that goal.
Uh-huh.
I don't like to proselytize. I don't like to, do that kind
understand.
of preaching on it.
Yep.
I don't like to say everybody has to have 100%, all the time for every condition.
Right.
I mean, it turns out that is the best because you allow your body to adapt to it. That's a really key point. We are addicted to our diets now, the way this has been shown with good evidence. We're addicted especially to fat, salt, and sugar. For one, we get addicted to some other things. And just like any other addiction, it takes a while to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So the transition to getting close to a whole food plant-based diet is difficult sometimes.
Right.
But once you get there, then you become accustomed to those things. And that's what you want while you're enjoying good health. So
I think you can have a very, personally, this may not be super popular, but I think you can have a very robust, healthy, good debate about what small percentage of the diet can be animal food, and you're still very healthy. But the point is, it's almost an academic argument, because that's going to be a small percentage based on the evidence. I think what the evidence points to, a very small or negligible percentage. And then we would get into the realm of practicality and behavior science. And in my experience with people, if you allow, I'll give you an example, pescatarians, people who still eat fish as their only meat, consistently, they have to ask me, is 3 ounces of meat a week 3 ounces of fish a week gonna hurt me? And I gotta say, from the science, I can't really answer that.
Depends on how much mercury is in it also,
right.
and any other
thing. That's a very small, that's like less than 1% of your diet.
3 ounces is not very much.
Almost nothing.
Right.
So I can't really answer that, but almost uniformly, when I see patients sitting in front of me, when they've opened the door a little bit to that, they've opened the door a little bit to a lot of other things, whether it's dairy, and even wider to processed foods, sugar foods, salt foods, or fatty foods. And we have sort of an obsession about talking about animal foods versus plant foods. But it's very important to remember processed versus whole, too. Processed versus whole, because we have a really big problem in Western diets with processed foods.
People that go vegetarian often have that huge problem right out of the gate.
Exactly. And you don't get maximum health benefits if you're still eating those things.
Maybe we should define processed foods.
Processed foods. I love your term, actually, this idea of food fragments. And I've used that ever since. If it's a fragment of what nature provided, if you imagine the fruit, imagine an olive. Okay, you have an olive growing on a tree. Instead of eating the olive, we're eating just the juice, the fragment of it. We've squished out the juice. It's oil, and we've thrown everything else out. So every time you fragment what was provided by nature, God, whatever you want to believe, we run into trouble. And so that's what I think of as processing.
A practical example, sometimes you could take these fragments from plants, believing they're good, put them in a bowl, mix them up, like, refined sugar, white flour, maybe some of that good oil from plants, mix it all up, and you got a donut. And so, that's what I think Tom's really referring
Right.
to is that,
Right.
taking the fragments out, even from good food, putting it together, mixing it up,
Yep.
to satisfy our addictions, if
Right.
you will.
Yeah.
Get
I
problems.
think that fragment idea is a clear idea, because technically frozen food is processed. It is mildly, it is on the processed spectrum because you're doing something to it.
Mm-hmm.
But frozen food is great. I mean, if you have frozen
Right.
stir fry, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
You
don't need the cherry with the seed. Right.
Yeah. Right.
We need to use another term, a better term than process, I think.
It's
Because
confusing.
process, we cook,
Yeah.
we do the other things.
That's a process. You're
Yeah,
right.
we do
Yep.
some kind of processing. We're not talking about that, as Tom just said.
Mm-hmm.
It's, taking it out, putting it back together in some fashion.
That's right.
Where the problem is.
So let me ask you this: we're responding to audience members as best we can, in some ways, distilling a lot of concepts that are going on here. We're just sitting in a room, kind of riffing, but we are talking about an article, a commentary that you published on nutritionstudies.org that was a response to this, a measured, thoughtful response. Is there anything that we haven't talked about here that you cover in the article? I know, we didn't want to go down the lectin rabbit hole necessarily too far. Is there anything else in the article that you published that we haven't covered yet?
No, I don't think specific to this book. I mean, I'm far more interested in why these things happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because it's a recurring event. When's the last time, a book came out saying something totally opposite? It's actually not the opposite of a plant-based diet.
Right.
It's low carb in disguise. It's kind of a low calorie, low carb in disguise, if you will.
So what are the conditions that lead to this? Why has this book taken hold? Maybe there's no answer. I don't know. Maybe we have more questions than answers.
I think it's a bit of an answer. There's a couple of more or less scientific or philosophical terms that really help me to understand things. One is called reductionism.
Okay.
The other is called holism.
Okay.
Reductionism is working with the parts. Just taking all those parts, doing with it whatever we want. And that's what, in fact, the practice of medicine is pretty much about. That's what we think, as non-professionals. We look at all these parts. And we do research that way in my community. You look at things, and it's okay to do that. It's a good practice because we learn something about the parts. It's chemistry, it's biochemistry, so forth and so on. That's fine. But the contrast of that is holism, where we're looking at everything together. And a lot of the confusion we get come from this just general acceptance of working with the parts, and that generates enormous amounts of confusion. Everybody can pick their favorite part, as I said before, and run some difficulties. I think for the future, as we look toward, using this information for better health and promotion of benefits elsewhere, we're going to have to actually deal with this question of talking about the wholeness of food. That's a really significant idea, I think.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I think I think fundamentally, in terms of thinking about our paradigms and the paradigms we live in and how we think about nutrition, what my dad said is absolutely foundational. From a day-to-day kind of perspective as to how these things happen, I think you have to think about the motivations of each person involved, each stakeholder involved in a project like this. There's the author, who of course wants to get their message out there. There's the publisher who wants to sell books, and kind of surprisingly, publishers don't necessarily vet the veracity of the content.
They're not qualified to do so usually.
Right. And there's the consumer. It's not just the blame of the author and the publisher, right? It's a lot of people are buying this book, and there's a pleasantness. There's a real comfort in buying something that sort of verifies what you already wanted to believe, or that you already believe. I mean, that sort of behavior is well known and well studied and well established, right? It's becoming even worse in our social media culture, where you just see things that you already believe.
That's right.
And people, John McDougall's saying is so apt that people love to hear good things about their bad habits. A lot of people don't. It's hard work to change. And I had a patient who grew up in I think with about 9 siblings. They were Catholic, practicing Catholics, and in adulthood he became Mormon. And then he developed some health issues, and he came to see me, and he changed his diet to his plant-based diet. He said that he had a much greater difficulty with changing his diet than changing his religion and his family.
Mhm.
And this is hard stuff. Changing your diet is hard stuff. And
Yep.
so if you give people an easy out, it's appealing. So
Mhm.
that kind of message keeps coming up. I can eat a lot of cheese, eat a lot of oil, find some meat, and by gosh, if I stick to those rules, I'm going to lose weight for a little while.
That's right.
And we just get into this cycle over and over and over and over and over. That the true it's in some ways it's a more difficult path. This is true of many things in life, right? And the more difficult path may be the more meaningful, long-lasting path, right?
Yes. Right. Short term, we're talking about weight gain.
Getting into
long term, we're talking about disease prevention and
Right.
so on, right? So
Right.
somebody realizes the short term gains,
right.
long term gains, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean,
That's not in my Amazon review.
Changing your
Right.
diet is not easy to do.
No.
If you want to turn it upside down 100%, going from the typical American diet to a whole food plant-based, that's a struggle.
That's a shock to the system.
in the short term.
Right.
And so it's easy to hear the easy path.
There's another, you just mentioned short term,
Hmm.
long term,
Yep.
another contrast.
Yep.
With a lot of these kind of things here too, you can sort of do some self-experimentation, or you can look up some data.
Yep.
And in reality, when people are using a wrong diet, if you will, high protein, high fat, low carb kind of thing, you can see some benefits. I mean, you lose some weight. That's pretty generally known.
Yep.
Especially for people who have an opportunity to lose some weight, and maybe seeing a couple other things too. And so that looks impressive. That sometimes looks impressive because it's a great sales pitch.
Mhm.
Here's the way it's going to be.
Yep.
But then the trick is, those are short-term results. Go back and have a look at the long-term thing.
Mhm.
And you see exactly the opposite. When you're talking about lifestyle, it's exactly the opposite oftentimes. And so people just look at the short-term. Their vision is just, here it is. And they're seeing it that way, and they're not asking questions about what the long-term is, because when you look at the long-term, you very clearly, people and societies and so forth and so on, when they're consuming, let's say, high-fat, high-protein diets, it's very clear.
Mhm.
More heart disease, more cancer, more this, more that.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. It's a reputable evidence. It can't be denied.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, as I say, short-term results can really fool us into long-term benefits. It doesn't happen that way.
Mhm.
Even with go back to the supplement thing, this is interesting.
Mhm.
I was actually the person who was on the docket, in Federal Trade Commission hearings when the whole vitamin supplement industry started.
Yep.
And I was asked to be the one to look at these claims and so
Right.
forth. And you had, when you looked at them and looked at the claims that they made, that this vitamin, that one, that one, that one did some good things, you looked at the evidence when they had it, they were generally referring to the amount circulating in the blood as a result of consuming whatever it is you're consuming.
Okay.
That's not an indication of
Mhm.
health benefits.
Okay.
That's an altogether different question, but
Right.
it's a little bit of trickery here.
I understand.
And so, and sometimes you can use these things maybe to actually overcome a problem or two
Mhm.
right in the short run,
Mhm.
if you are already deficient in that.
Mhm.
That's also possible.
So the good news is you're a couple smart guys, and we don't just read books that are disappointing. Do you have any resources that you can recommend for people to kind of sort through some of these problems that we've discussed here? Any particular books or resources jump out at you? Naturally, nutritionstudies.org is the place to go. What else have you been into lately?
Well, we co-authored a book that we were, this is our specialty,
Right.
the China Study.
The China Study, sure.
And then that's a follow-up book. The whole Tom has one called the China Study Solution. So
Yep.
we've been busy writing some of that stuff, and you can find that there in those books for starters.
Right.
Ultimately, the sad truth is that I think it's very hard to sort through for the average person, every claim that comes flying out. Because to really assess it, you have to go back to the original science and read the original science and see if it's justified.
I got it.
And that's beyond the scope of what most people are willing or can do. And so you have someone who's highly credentialed saying something totally opposite of someone else who's highly credentialed. And I always say to people, I don't care if you have 5 PhDs, if you're standing in front of that bookshelf at Barnes and Noble, there's a good chance you're going to be horrifically confused. And it's hard to get around that. But if on the flip side, there's people who kind of make this nutrition thing a bit of a hobby, and they start getting into the realm of the plant-based community. The John McDougall's of the world, the Dean Ornishes of the world, the Esselstyns of the world, nutrition studies. These are all fantastic resources, and they almost become hobbyists, in terms of looking at the information, seeing what the science seems to say, seeing if it seems reliable. And if you really put some time in, you can kind of weed through in that way. But there is a group of resources that are very good. Dean Ornish, Caldwell Esselstyn, Mangentu, Rip Esselstyn, Plant Pure Nation, Michael Greger, Nutrition Facts. Yeah, of course, that's one of the biggest. And nutrition studies. And so Nutrition Facts, for example, I mean, are these claims cited with good studies? What's so dangerous about this is that it looks like it's cited, but there's absolutely it's actually not linked to any good studies. It just has a little number, in the text. So it's very confusing until you actually look at the citation. But are there studies behind it? Are people explaining the science? Does the science seem to make sense, and is it consistent with the observations that we know to be true in the world? Yeah. If you start to look at these questions with some habits and with some consistency, you can sort of weed through it.
Yep, a lot. Right. So this requires a lot of homework from each of us. I have to answer some questions that keep coming up over and over, which is, as soon as this recording's over, we're going to make this recording available to all of you. For those of you who have registered, those of you who had to bail early, who aren't even hearing this, but this will all be available through the nutritionstudies.org website afterward, and we're going to be emailing everybody that registered so that they can refer to this afterward. A couple other notes, and I said this earlier, it's been a little bit, but I recommend that you check out the Plant-Based Nutrition Certificate, which was produced with you two and several others, like 25 other experts who are working in this space as part of the eCornell certificate program. It's a multi-course, 100% online certificate program that I think would suit this audience quite well. So again, recording available, Plant-Based Nutrition Certificate available in the bottom right, just below the chat. Click that and you can of course access it. I recommend that you check out the article as well. I'm going to go through some of these questions here, see if we can finish on a little Q&A, although they are flying by. I can't even read them. Let me just take a moment here. Let's talk about disease prevention. That's something that we haven't really touched here. What do you think of some of his recommendations for disease prevention?
Well, that's an old concept, of course. Our grandmothers told us to eat this food, by the way.
Yeah.
We wouldn't get maybe heart disease and other sorts of issues when you get older.
Yeah.
And of course, the medical profession itself, which Tom can speak to better than I, but the concept of preventive medicine,
yes,
has been around a long time.
Yep.
It doesn't get the play I think it should. But I would also like to add, this business here is not just about preventing future diseases. What I find fascinating is that people who already have problems, if they switch, you can actually develop there's a lot of evidence now showing you can actually reverse those conditions. I'm going to suggest, the word for that is treatment.
Okay, right.
So now we're talking about a new domain. There's prevention, yes.
Yeah.
But the same thing can happen in a lot of cases. We're going to have to do more research on this, but I'm going to predict that the future is really going to rest on the question concerning switching to this diet and watching illnesses be treated.
You're pointing to the plant paradox as you're saying.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
I think it was pointing to you.
Yeah, sorry.
Be careful there. I think that there's a study showing that about 80% of all chronic disease can be prevented with simple lifestyle changes: not smoking, exercising, eating moderately well, maintaining a healthy weight. I mean, you do those four things, and a lot of our chronic disease can be prevented, it turns out.
Right. Kind of jives with the statement, there's nothing new under the sun, right?
Yeah.
We all know this.
And it's the same formula.
Yeah.
It's the same dietary protocol.
That's right.
That does both.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think it should be called a fact of nature.
Uh-huh.
I have a reason for saying that, but I think it's a nice expression.
There you go. Any final thoughts before we close out, gentlemen? It looks like we're running up against clock. I should say, again, audience, thank you for all the questions. There is going to be some follow-up questions. Jenny, I believe, we'll post some of these, and maybe we'll pick a top 10 or something along those lines of most popular questions, because we do see trends, and a lot of people are kind of hitting the same points. Pretty well-educated audience, I should say. So keep an eye out for the follow-up emails that accompany this, the recording that's coming out, and we hope to get some of your questions. With several hundred people, I admit it was a little bit difficult to get to, but I thought it was a great discussion. Thanks, gents.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, audience. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.